Welcome. You have made it here to this quiet hour at the end of your day. As you settle in, let your mind slow. Let the concerns of today fade, little by little. Tonight we are going to step back 2,000 years to the hills of Galilee and the highlands of Judea. We are going to see how families in the time of Jesus survived the cold winter nights in their stone homes. For half the year, the rains came. Temperatures dropped. Darkness arrived early and lingered long. In those small windowless rooms, staying warm was not a convenience. It was survival. Their methods were practical, built from the materials at hand and refined over generations. There was no single answer. It was stone and clay, fire and wool, animals and shared breath. It was a system, quiet and steady, that kept them alive. Over the next while, we will move through one winter night in a first-century home. We will see how the family prepared as the sun went down, how they maintained warmth through the long hours of darkness, and how they woke again at dawn. So settle in. Let the story unfold at its own pace. The first century fell within a period known as the Roman climatic optimum. This was a time when the Mediterranean basin experienced relatively warm and stable temperatures. The seas were warmer than they would be in later centuries. The winters were milder than those that had come before. But mild is a relative term. In the Galilee, winter meant rain. Heavy, persistent rain that turned the courtyards to mud and required constant attention to the flat roofs of the homes. The rains began in late autumn and continued through the coldest months. The ground became saturated. The paths between the villages turned to thick clay that clung to sandals and made travel slow. In the highlands of Judea, the cold went deeper. Jerusalem and Bethlehem sat at elevations where freezing temperatures were common. Snow fell occasionally, though it rarely lasted more than a day or two. The night air could drop well below the point where water froze. The stone walls radiated cold inward, and the wind found every gap in the doorway. Even during the Roman climatic optimum, the winter season was a time of physiological stress. The body worked harder to maintain its core temperature. Food intake had to increase to support the metabolic demand. Sleep became more difficult without adequate warmth. The sun set early in winter. By mid-afternoon, the light was already fading. Once the sun dropped below the horizon, the temperature fell rapidly. Stone loses heat quickly when the source of warmth is removed. A house that had been comfortable during the day could become uncomfortably cold within an hour of sunset. Marine sediment records from the Sicily Channel indicate that the Mediterranean Sea was approximately 2 degrees Celsius warmer during the Roman period than it is in the modern era. This warmth influenced the intensity of winter storms. Warmer seas meant more moisture in the air, which translated to heavier rainfall when the storms moved inland over the Levant. The climate was not uniform across the region. Coastal areas remained milder. The Jordan Valley, sitting below sea level, rarely experienced frost. But in the hill country, where most of the population lived, the winters demanded preparation. Historical records from earlier centuries describe winters severe enough to freeze rivers in Italy. The Tiber froze completely in 398, 396, 271, and 177 BCE. These events were considered catastrophic, and they served as reminders that the climate, even during a relatively stable period, could turn harsh without warning. For the families living in the villages of Galilee and Judea, the threat was not so much ice as it was the persistent cold combined with dampness. Wet cold penetrates deeper than dry cold. The rain-soaked ground, the damp walls, the moisture in the air, all of these made the night more difficult to endure. The body loses heat in several ways. Conduction transfers heat to cooler surfaces in direct contact, such as a cold floor. Convection moves heat away through the circulation of air. Radiation disperses heat into the surrounding environment. Evaporation, particularly from damp skin or clothing, accelerates heat loss. In a stone home during a Galilean winter, all of these mechanisms were at work. The challenge was to slow each one enough that the body's internal heat production could keep pace with the loss. The people of the first century understood this challenge. They did not have the vocabulary of thermodynamics, but they had centuries of accumulated experience. They knew that certain materials held warmth better than others. They knew that smaller spaces were easier to heat. They knew that bodies huddled together stayed warmer than bodies sleeping apart. Winter was not an anomaly. It came every year, predictable and unavoidable. The families prepared for it the same way they prepared for planting and harvest. It was part of the rhythm of life, a season to be endured with patience and careful management of resources. The cold was real. The threat was real. But so were the solutions built into the architecture, the daily routines, and the shared practices of the community. The homes in the first century Levant were built from stone. This was not a matter of preference or aesthetic choice. It was dictated by the geology of the region. In Galilee, the dominant stone was basalt. This dark volcanic rock formed from ancient lava flows that had cooled and solidified millions of years before the first humans arrived. Basalt was dense and heavy. It could be split into rough blocks with hammers and chisels, though it resisted shaping into fine, even surfaces. In Judea, the stone was limestone. This sedimentary rock was softer than basalt and easier to work. It could be carved into smooth blocks with more precision. The limestone bedrock often extended close to the surface, which made quarrying simpler. In some places, entire rooms were hewn directly into the rock itself, creating cave-like dwellings that required no walls at all. The choice of stone was determined by what lay beneath the village. Transporting heavy blocks over long distances was impractical. A family building a home used the material that was closest to hand. This meant that Galilean homes looked different from Judean homes, not because of cultural preference, but because the earth itself was different. Stone served as the foundation of survival. It was the first and most important barrier between the family and the winter cold. The process of building a stone home began with the selection of a site. Ideally, this would be on slightly elevated ground to allow for drainage during the rainy season. The bedrock was cleared of soil and large foundation stones were laid directly on the rock. These foundation stones were irregular in shape, chosen for their size and stability, rather than their appearance. Once the foundation was in place, the walls began to rise. The largest stones, sometimes weighing several hundred kilograms, were positioned at the corners. These cornerstones, called lithos goniaios in Greek, served as anchors for the rest of the wall. They were carefully selected for their strength and were often the only stones in the wall that were intentionally shaped. Between the cornerstones, smaller stones were stacked in rough courses. The fit was not tight. Gaps and voids were inevitable. These gaps were filled with smaller stones, fragments of pottery, and a mixture of mud, chalk, and straw. This earth mortar acted as both a binding agent and an insulator, sealing the wall against drafts. The thickness of the walls was critical. In most homes, the walls measured approximately 60 centimeters from the outer face to the inner face. This thickness was necessary to support the weight of the roof, which was made of wooden beams covered with a thick layer of earth and compacted clay. But the thickness also served a thermal function. Stone has a property called thermal mass. This means it can absorb large amounts of heat energy and release it slowly over time. During the day, even a weak winter sun would warm the exterior surface of the stone. The heat would begin to migrate inward, moving slowly through the 60-centimeter barrier. By the time the sun set, the outer surface of the wall would be cool again, but the interior mass of the stone would still hold warmth from earlier in the day. This stored heat would continue to radiate inward for hours, smoothing out the temperature difference between day and night. The effect was not dramatic. A stone wall does not keep a room warm in the way a modern furnace does, but it slows the rate at which warmth escapes. It creates a buffer, a delay, that makes the difference between a livable space and one that is unbearably cold. The interior surfaces of the walls were often finished with a layer of plaster. This plaster was made from lime, mixed with sand and ash. When applied wet, it bonded to the stone and dried into a hard, smooth surface. In wealthier homes, the plaster was polished to a fine finish and sometimes painted with simple geometric patterns or borders. The primary function of the plaster was to seal the wall. Stone, especially basalt, is porous. Water can seep through it, particularly during prolonged rain. A wet wall loses its insulating properties. The moisture conducts heat away from the interior much faster than dry stone. Plaster acted as a waterproof barrier, keeping the wall dry and maintaining its thermal efficiency. In some homes, particularly those carved into limestone bedrock, the walls were left unplastered. The natural rock surface was smooth enough to serve as a finished interior. These cave homes had an advantage in winter. The surrounding rock extended deep into the earth, where the temperature remained relatively stable year-round. The earth itself acted as insulation, moderating the temperature inside the dwelling. The construction of a stone home was labor-intensive. It required the cooperation of extended family and neighbors. Men quarried and hauled the stone. Women and children gathered the materials for mortar. The work could take months or even years, depending on the size of the structure and the availability of labor. But once completed, the stone home was a permanent structure. It did not rot like wood or collapse like mud brick. It stood for generations, passed from parent to child, a fixed point in a landscape where so much else was transient. The stone was more than a building material. It was a tool for survival, a technology refined over centuries, adapted to the specific demands of the climate and the resources of the land. 60 centimeters. That was the standard thickness of a first-century stone wall in the villages of Galilee and Judea. This measurement was not arbitrary. It was the result of structural necessity and practical experience. The walls had to support the roof. The roofs of these homes were heavy. Wooden beams, typically cut from local trees, were laid across the top of the walls. The beams were spaced close together, often no more than half a meter apart. Across these beams, a layer of reeds or branches was placed. On top of the reeds, a thick layer of mud mixed with straw was spread and compacted. When dry, this mud layer formed a hard, waterproof surface. But it was heavy. The combined weight of the beams, the reeds, and the compacted earth could easily exceed the load-bearing capacity of a thin wall. A wall less than 60 centimeters thick would crack under the strain, or, in some cases, collapse outward under the horizontal thrust of the roof. So the walls were built thick enough to carry the load, thick enough to stand for decades without buckling. But the thickness also served another purpose, one that had nothing to do with structure. Stone is a poor insulator compared to modern materials like fiberglass or foam. Its thermal conductivity is relatively high, meaning heat passes through it more easily than through materials specifically designed to trap warmth. But stone has a different property that makes it valuable in a cold climate: thermal mass. Thermal mass is the ability of a material to absorb and store heat energy. A material with high thermal mass can take in large amounts of heat without a significant rise in temperature. Once heated, it releases that energy slowly over time. A 60-centimeter stone wall has a significant thermal mass. During the day, the exterior surface of the wall is exposed to sunlight. Even in winter, even on a cloudy day, the sun provides some radiant heat. The surface of the stone absorbs this heat. The energy begins to move inward through the thickness of the wall. Heat moves through solid materials by conduction. Molecules vibrate faster when they are heated, and this vibration is transferred to neighboring molecules. The process is slow. In a 60-centimeter wall, it can take several hours for heat to migrate from the outer surface to the inner surface. By the time the sun sets, the outer surface of the wall has cooled. The air temperature has dropped. But the heat absorbed earlier in the day is still traveling through the thickness of the stone. The inner surface of the wall remains warmer than the air outside. It continues to radiate heat into the room. This effect is called thermal lag. It delays the transfer of cold from the outside to the inside. It smooths out the temperature fluctuations that would otherwise occur between day and night. The benefit is modest. A stone wall does not make a room warm. It makes a room less cold. It slows the rate at which the interior temperature drops after sunset. For a family trying to conserve fuel and maintain warmth through the night, this delay is significant. The calculation of heat transfer through a wall can be expressed mathematically. The rate of heat transfer depends on the thickness of the wall, the thermal conductivity of the material, and the temperature difference between the inside and outside surfaces. The formula for thermal resistance is straightforward. Resistance equals thickness divided by conductivity. A thicker wall has higher resistance. Higher resistance means slower heat transfer. Slower heat transfer means less heat lost from the interior to the exterior over the course of the night. The builders of the first century did not work with formulas. They worked with experience. They knew that a thick wall stayed warmer longer than a thin wall. They knew that a home built with 60-centimeter walls was more comfortable in winter than one built with thinner walls. So they built thick walls. The thickness also had a practical construction benefit. Thicker walls were more forgiving of imperfect stonework. The irregular stones and rough mortar joints that characterized village architecture could be accommodated within a thick wall. The mass of the wall compensated for the lack of precision in individual blocks. In wealthier homes, particularly in urban areas, the stones were more carefully shaped and fitted. The mortar joints were thinner, but the walls were still thick because thickness was fundamental to the structural and thermal performance of the building. The walls were not uniform throughout the house. Load-bearing walls which supported the roof were always the full 60 centimeters. Interior partition walls, which divided the space into smaller rooms but did not carry roof loads, could be thinner. These interior walls were often built from lighter materials or with less careful construction, since they did not need the same structural capacity. But even the interior walls contributed to the thermal mass of the house. Every stone surface, every plastered wall, acted as a heat sink during the day and a heat source during the night. The more mass, the more stable the temperature. The placement of the walls also mattered. External walls, exposed to the wind and rain, needed to be thicker and more carefully sealed than walls that faced into a protected courtyard. In courtyard houses, where several rooms were arranged around a central open space, the interior-facing walls could be somewhat thinner because they were sheltered from the worst of the weather. The stone itself varied in its thermal properties. Basalt, being denser, had a higher thermal mass than limestone. This meant that a basalt wall could store more heat than a limestone wall of the same thickness. But basalt was also harder to work and more difficult to shape, so the choice was often a trade-off between thermal performance and ease of construction. Limestone had another advantage. It was softer and more porous, which made it easier to carve and finish. When plastered, it bonded well with the lime plaster, creating a smooth, continuous surface. This continuity was important for preventing drafts and maintaining the integrity of the thermal envelope. The thickness of the walls was one of the most visible features of these homes. From the outside, the walls gave the building a solid, massive appearance. From the inside, the thickness was evident in the depth of the window openings and doorways. In most homes, there were no windows at all, or only small, high slits for ventilation. The doors were narrow, and the walls around them were deep. This depth, this mass, was the foundation of the home's ability to protect its inhabitants from the winter cold. It was not dramatic. It was not sufficient on its own, but it was essential. Without the thickness of the walls, without the thermal mass of the stone, the other strategies for staying warm would have been much less effective. The walls were the first line of defense. Everything else built upon them. A wall made of stacked stones is not a solid barrier. No matter how carefully the stones are fitted, gaps remain. Air can pass through these gaps. Water can seep through them. Heat can escape through them. The builders of the first century understood this. They knew that a wall of stone alone was not enough. The gaps had to be sealed. The primary material for sealing was earth mortar. This was a mixture of mud, chalk, and straw, combined with water and worked into a thick paste. The mud provided the bulk of the material. The chalk, derived from pulverized limestone, added binding strength. The straw gave the mixture tensile integrity, preventing it from cracking as it dried. The mortar was pressed into the gaps between the stones. It filled the voids, creating a continuous barrier that blocked the flow of air. It also helped to distribute the load of the upper stones more evenly, reducing the stress on any single point in the wall. The process of applying the mortar was labor-intensive. It had to be done by hand, working the paste into every crack and crevice. Once applied, the mortar needed time to dry. During the rainy season, this could take weeks. The wall had to be protected from heavy rain while the mortar cured, or the paste would wash out before it hardened. In some homes, particularly those built by wealthier families or in urban areas, the exterior walls were finished with a layer of lime plaster. Lime plaster was more durable than earth mortar. It resisted water better and provided a harder, more permanent surface. Lime plaster was made by heating limestone to high temperatures in a kiln. This process, called calcination, drove off the carbon dioxide and left behind quicklime. The quicklime was then mixed with water, which caused a chemical reaction that produced slaked lime. The slaked lime was mixed with sand and sometimes with ash to create a workable plaster. When applied to a stone wall, lime plaster bonded to the surface and formed a hard, waterproof coating. This coating protected the stone from moisture and prevented the growth of moss and lichen, which could accelerate the weathering of the wall. The waterproofing provided by lime plaster was critical in the rainy season. A wet wall conducts heat much faster than a dry wall. Moisture fills the pores in the stone, creating pathways for heat to escape. A wall that is saturated with water loses its insulating capacity. It becomes a thermal bridge, channeling warmth from the interior to the cold exterior. By keeping the wall dry, the plaster maintained the thermal efficiency of the structure. This was not widely understood in scientific terms at the time, but it was evident from experience. A house with well-plastered walls was warmer and more comfortable than one where the plaster had cracked or eroded. Interior walls were also plastered, though the plaster used inside was often simpler. The same earth mortar that filled the gaps between the stones could be smoothed over the entire interior surface, creating a flat, continuous finish. In some cases, this interior plaster was mixed with lime to give it greater durability and a smoother texture. The interior plaster served several functions. It sealed the wall against drafts, which was important in a home with no glass windows and only simple wooden doors. It provided a clean surface that could be whitewashed or painted, and it helped to even out the thermal mass of the wall, ensuring that the heat radiating from the stone was distributed evenly across the surface. The application of plaster was typically done by the women of the household. It was a skill that was passed down from mother to daughter. The technique required a good eye and a steady hand. The plaster had to be applied in thin, even layers, working from bottom to top. If the layer was too thick, it would sag or crack. If it was too thin, it would not provide adequate coverage. Once the plaster was applied, it was smoothed with wooden or stone tools. In wealthier homes, the final surface was polished to a fine finish using rounded stones. This polishing process compacted the plaster, making it harder and more resistant to wear. The maintenance of the plaster was an ongoing task. Rain eroded the exterior surfaces. Interior plaster could crack if the walls settled, or if the building experienced any kind of structural movement. Repairs were made as needed, typically in the dry season when the plaster would have time to cure before the rains returned. The straw mixed into the earth mortar played a critical role. As the mortar dried, the straw fibers created a network of tiny channels throughout the material. These channels allowed moisture to evaporate evenly, reducing the formation of large cracks. The straw also provided tensile strength, holding the dried mortar together even under stress. The source of the straw was usually the threshing floor, where grain was separated from the chaff. The leftover chaff and short straw stalks were collected and mixed with the mud. This reuse of agricultural waste was typical of the economy of the first century, where nothing was discarded, if it could be put to another use. The chalk used in the mortar was often gathered from the bedrock itself. In many areas, the limestone bedrock contained layers of soft, crumbly chalk. This could be easily pulverized and mixed with the mud. The chalk reacted with moisture in the air to form weak carbonate bonds, which helped to harden the mortar over time. In areas where limestone was not available, such as the basalt regions of Galilee, the mortar relied more heavily on clay. The clay was dug from riverbeds or from the soil beneath the topsoil layer. It had good binding properties when mixed with water, though it was more prone to cracking than chalk-based mortar. The sealing of the gaps was not a one-time task. It was part of the annual cycle of maintenance. Each spring after the rains had ended, families inspected their homes for damage. Cracks in the plaster were repaired. Sections of wall where the mortar had washed out were repointed. The flat roofs, which also relied on compacted earth, were rolled and resealed to prevent leaks in the next rainy season. This maintenance was essential. A house that was allowed to deteriorate quickly became uninhabitable. Water damage weakened the walls, drafts made the interior uncomfortable. The loss of thermal mass reduced the effectiveness of the hearth fire. The gap between rough construction and a livable home was the work of sealing. The stone provided structure. The mortar and plaster provided comfort. Together they created a barrier that was strong enough to withstand the weather and tight enough to keep the warmth inside. Most of the rooms in a first-century Galilean or Judean home were small, 9 square meters or less. This was the typical size. The limitation was not a matter of choice. It was determined by the materials available for roofing. The roofs were supported by wooden beams. These beams were cut from local trees, primarily oak, pine, or terebinth. The length of the beams was constrained by the size of the trees in the region. Most beams were 3 meters long or less. Some were longer, but these were rare and expensive. A beam could only span the distance between two opposing walls. If the walls were more than 3 meters apart, the beam would sag under the weight of the roof. If the span was much greater, the beam would break. This structural limit defined the width of the room. A room could be no wider than the longest available beam. In practice, this meant that most rooms were 3 meters wide, or slightly less. The length of the room was more flexible. Multiple beams could be laid parallel to one another, spanning the width of the room and extending as far along the length as needed. But the width was fixed by the span of the beams. A room 3 meters wide and 3 meters long encloses an area of 9 square meters. This was the standard size for a single room in a simple house. In larger homes, multiple rooms were built side by side, sharing common walls. Each room was still constrained by the beam length, but the overall footprint of the house could be expanded by adding more rooms. In courtyard houses, several small rooms were arranged around a central open space, creating a larger complex while still maintaining the small individual room sizes. The small size of the rooms had significant thermal implications. A small room contains a small volume of air. Air has to be heated to make a room comfortable. The smaller the volume, the less energy is required to raise the temperature. A fire in the center of a 9 square meter room will heat the space much faster than the same fire in a larger room. The warmth radiates outward from the fire, and in a small space, it quickly fills the available volume. The walls, being close to the fire, absorb heat and begin to radiate it back into the room. In a larger room, the fire has to work harder. The heat dissipates into a greater volume. The walls are farther away and absorb less heat. More fuel is required to achieve the same level of warmth. For a family with limited fuel, this difference was critical. Fuel was not abundant. Wood had to be gathered or purchased. Dung had to be collected and dried. Olive pomace, when available, had to be obtained from the village oil press. Every bit of fuel was precious. A small room allowed a family to maintain warmth with a small fire, a fire that could burn for hours on a modest supply of fuel, a fire that did not require constant tending or frequent additions of new material. The smallness also made the room easier to seal. There were fewer cracks to fill, fewer gaps around the door, less surface area through which heat could escape. The ratio of wall area to floor area was high, which meant that the thermal mass of the walls had a greater influence on the interior temperature. The ceiling height in these rooms was low, often no more than 2 meters from the floor to the underside of the roof beams. This low ceiling reduced the volume of the room even further. It also kept the warmest air, which rises, closer to the level where people sat and slept. In a room with a higher ceiling, the warmest air would collect near the roof, leaving the lower portion of the room colder. In a room with a low ceiling, the temperature gradient from floor to ceiling was less pronounced. The entire space stayed more evenly warm. The low ceiling also reduced the amount of smoke that could accumulate before it became uncomfortable. Smoke from the hearth fire rose and collected against the ceiling. If the ceiling was very high, a large volume of smoke could build up before it began to drift down into the living space. With a low ceiling, the smoke reached the level of the occupants more quickly, which forced better ventilation practices. Most homes did not have chimneys. Smoke escaped through gaps in the roof or through a deliberate opening left for that purpose. The smoke layer hung in the upper portion of the room, and the family lived in. The clear air zone below. The low ceiling meant that the clear air zone was closer to the floor, which influenced how people used the space. Sitting and sleeping were done on the floor or on low platforms. Standing was less common. Walking around inside the home meant moving through a layer of haze. People learned to minimize their time in the smoke zone and to keep their activities low. The furniture, when present, was low to the ground. Stools and benches were short. Sleeping mats were placed directly on the floor or on a raised platform that was still only half a meter high. The hearth itself was often set into a shallow depression, keeping the flames in the hottest part of the fire below the level of the floor. The small size of the rooms also influenced social behavior. A 9 square meter room cannot comfortably hold a large group. Extended family gatherings took place in the courtyard or in the largest room of the house, which was still small by modern standards. For daily life, the family worked in close proximity. There was little privacy. Activities were visible to everyone in the room. The boundaries between individuals were social rather than spatial. This closeness had a thermal benefit. People generate heat. A human body at rest produces approximately 100 watts of heat, roughly equivalent to a standard incandescent light bulb. In a small room with several people, this body heat contributed to the overall warmth of the space. During the day, when people were active, the metabolic heat production was higher. Work generated warmth. Even simple tasks like grinding grain or kneading dough raised the body temperature and warmed the air. At night, when the family gathered to sleep, the concentration of bodies in a small space created a pool of warmth. The collective heat of several people sleeping close together could raise the temperature of the room by a few degrees, enough to make the difference between discomfort and rest. The small fire, the small room, the close proximity of the family, all of these worked together. None of them alone would have been sufficient. But in combination, they created an environment where warmth could be maintained through the night without burning through an unsustainable amount of fuel. The design was not intentional in the sense of being planned according to a theory of heat conservation. It was the result of practical constraints and accumulated experience. Families built small rooms because they had short beams. They kept small fires because they had limited fuel. They slept close together because the space was small and the night was cold. But the result was a functional system, refined over generations, that allowed them to survive the winter in a landscape that offered little natural protection from the cold. In the center of the main room, or sometimes against one wall, was the hearth. This was the functional center of the household. Everything else in the room was positioned in relation to it. The hearth was not a complex structure. In its simplest form, it was a shallow depression in the floor, lined with flat stones to protect the packed earth beneath from the direct heat of the fire. The stones absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back slowly through the night. In some homes, the hearth was slightly elevated, built up from the floor with a ring of stones mortared together. This elevation improved airflow beneath the fire and made it easier to tend without bending all the way to the ground. It also helped to contain the ashes and embers, preventing them from spreading across the floor. The hearth was where the cooking happened. A clay pot could be placed directly on the coals, or suspended above them on a simple tripod made of iron or stone. The daily pottage, a thick stew of lentils, beans, and whatever vegetables were available, simmered for hours over a low fire. The slow cooking allowed tough grains and legumes to soften and become digestible. Bread was not typically baked over the open hearth. For that, families used a taboon or tannour oven, which we will discuss shortly. But the hearth fire could be used for quick cooking tasks. Flatbreads could be baked directly on the hot stones. Fish could be grilled on sticks held over the coals. Vegetables could be roasted in the embers. The fire provided light. During the daylight hours, this was less important. Light came through the door or through small openings high in the walls. But as the sun set and the interior of the stone house grew dark, the fire became the primary source of illumination. The quality of the light was different from what we are accustomed to. It was warm and flickering, casting moving shadows across the walls. The light did not reach the corners of the room. Those remained in darkness. The space around the fire was a circle of visibility, and beyond that circle, the room faded into shadow. The fire also provided warmth, though this was not its only purpose. The warmth was a byproduct of cooking and light, but it was a necessary byproduct. Without the fire, the room would have been unbearably cold on a winter night. The management of the fire required skill. A fire that burned too hot consumed fuel quickly and created excessive smoke. A fire that burned too low did not provide enough heat or light. The goal was a steady, moderate fire that could be maintained for hours without constant attention. The type of fuel determined how the fire behaved. Wood, when available, burned hot and bright. It was easy to ignite and produced a clean flame with relatively little smoke, but wood was scarce in many parts of the Levant. Centuries of settlement and agriculture had stripped the hillsides of their forests. What trees remained were valuable and often protected. Charcoal was an alternative. It burned hotter than wood and produced less smoke, making it ideal for cooking. But charcoal had to be produced through a labor-intensive process of slow combustion in a sealed pit. It was expensive and generally reserved for metalworking or for wealthier households. Most families relied on secondary fuels. These were materials that would otherwise have been waste, but which could be dried and burned. The fire was never allowed to go out completely during the winter. Maintaining the fire overnight was more efficient than relighting it from scratch each morning. Relighting required kindling, which was also scarce, and it took time for the new fire to build up enough heat to be useful. Instead, the fire was banked before sleep. The coals were covered with a layer of ash, which slowed the combustion and preserved the embers. In the morning, the ash was brushed aside, fresh fuel was added, and the fire was brought back to life by blowing gently on the embers. The hearth was also a social center. In the evening, the family gathered around it. This was when stories were told, when the events of the day were discussed, when children learned the oral traditions of their people. The fire drew people together, both physically and socially. The position around the fire was often determined by status and age. The head of the household sat closest to the warmth. Elders were given priority. Children sat farther back. In the outer circle of the firelight, the hearth was sacred in some traditions. In Roman households, the hearth was associated with the goddess Vesta, and the fire was tended with ritual care. In Jewish households, the fire had no explicit religious significance, but it was treated with respect. It was the source of life and comfort, and its maintenance was a responsibility that could not be neglected. The ashes from the hearth were not wasted. They were collected and used in the production of soap, mixed with fat to create a cleaning agent. They were also used in the tanning of leather and in the preparation of lime for plaster. Even the residue of the fire had value. The hearth fire was not large. In a room 9 square meters in size, a large fire would have been overwhelming. The heat would have been too intense, the smoke too thick. A small fire, no more than a few handfuls of fuel burning at any given time, was sufficient. This small fire could be fed gradually throughout the evening. A few sticks of wood, a handful of dried dung, a piece of olive pomace. Each addition extended the life of the fire without creating a sudden flare that consumed the fuel too quickly. The rhythm of tending the fire became automatic. Every hour or so, someone would add a small amount of fuel. The fire would brighten briefly, then settle back into its steady glow. This rhythm continued until the family was ready to sleep, at which point the fire was banked and left to smolder through the night. The warmth from the hearth was not evenly distributed. The air directly above the fire was hot. The floor around the fire absorbed heat and became warm to the touch. But the far corners of the room, away from the fire, remained cold. The temperature gradient from the center of the room to the edges could be significant. This gradient influenced how the space was used. The sleeping platform, where the family would spend the night, was typically positioned as close to the hearth as was safe. The storage areas, where grain and tools were kept, were in the colder parts of the room. The animals, if they were inside, occupied the coldest zone, farthest from the fire. The hearth was vulnerable. If the rain came through a crack in the roof and fell directly on the fire, it could be extinguished. If the wind blew strongly through the door, it could scatter the ashes and carry embers onto the floor, creating a fire hazard. The hearth had to be protected and monitored. The fire was the heart of the home, in a literal sense. It was the source of energy, the center of activity, the focal point around which everything else was arranged. Without it, the stone house was just a cold, dark box. With it, the House became a place where life could continue through the winter. The tabun and tanner ovens were essential to the domestic economy of the first century household. These were not the open hearth fires used for heating and light. These were specialized structures built from thick clay designed for baking bread. The two types of ovens were similar in function but different in shape. The tanner was taller, shaped like a beehive or a vertical cylinder. It could be as much as a meter high, with a narrow opening at the top. Bread dough was slapped onto the interior walls, where it baked in the intense heat radiating from the clay. The tabun was lower and broader, shaped like a dome. It had a side opening where fuel could be added and where the bread could be inserted and removed. The tabun was more common in village homes, as it was easier to build and required less skill to operate. Both ovens were constructed from clay mixed with straw and sand. The mixture was shaped by hand, built up, in layers and allowed to dry slowly. Once dry, the clay hardened into a durable ceramic shell that could withstand high temperatures without cracking. The walls of the oven were thick, often 10 to 15 centimeters. This thickness was necessary for structural stability, but it also served a thermal function. The thick clay walls absorbed enormous amounts of heat when the oven was fired. Baking bread required a very hot oven. The interior temperature could reach 400 degrees Celsius or more. To achieve this, the oven was filled with fuel and ignited. The fuel burned intensely for an hour or more, heating the clay to its maximum capacity. Once the oven was hot enough, the fuel was raked out or allowed to burn down to embers. The bread dough was then placed inside, where it baked in the residual heat radiating from the clay walls. The baking process took only a few minutes, as the intense heat cooked the bread quickly. But the heat stored in the clay did not dissipate quickly. Even after the bread was removed, the oven remained hot for hours. This residual heat was not wasted. In winter, the oven became a secondary heat source for the home. After the day's baking was finished, the oven continued to radiate warmth into the room. If the oven was located inside the main living space, as it often was, this warmth contributed significantly to the comfort of the household. Some families built their ovens in a partially enclosed kitchen area adjacent to the main room. This allowed the heat from the oven to be directed into the living space, while containing the smoke and ash from the baking process. In homes excavated at sites like Katsran in the Golan Heights, these domed kitchen areas show evidence of careful design to maximize heat retention. The clay acted as a thermal battery. It absorbed energy during the firing process and released it slowly over time. The rate of heat release depended on the thickness of the walls and the temperature differential between the clay and the surrounding air. A well-built oven could remain warm to the touch for 12 hours or more after the fire was extinguished. Families learned to time their baking to coincide with the coldest part of the day. Baking in the late afternoon meant that the oven would be at its hottest during the early evening, when the outside temperature was dropping. The residual heat would carry through the night, providing a gentle warmth that supplemented the hearth fire. The oven was also used for slow cooking tasks that did not require an open flame. After the bread was baked and the temperature had dropped somewhat, a pot of stew could be placed inside the oven. The residual heat would cook the stew slowly overnight, tenderizing tough cuts of meat or fibrous vegetables without the need for active tending. This slow cooking method was fuel efficient. The heat used to bake the bread was not wasted. It was harnessed for additional cooking and for heating the home. Every unit of energy extracted from the scarce fuel supply was put to multiple uses. The construction of a tabun or tanner was a significant investment. The clay had to be gathered and prepared. The oven had to be built by someone with experience, as improper construction could lead to cracks or collapse. Once built, the oven required maintenance. Cracks had to be repaired with fresh clay. The interior had to be cleaned of ash and soot. But the oven lasted for years. It was a permanent fixture of the household, passed down from one generation to the next. In archaeological excavations, the remains of these ovens are among the most common features found in domestic contexts. Their presence indicates not just the practice of baking, but a sophisticated understanding of heat management. The fuel used in the ovens was similar to that used in the hearth, though the requirements were different. Baking required a rapid, intense burn to achieve the high temperatures needed. This meant that wood or charcoal was preferred, as these fuels burned hotter than dung or straw. However, in areas where wood was scarce, dried dung could be used if it was combined with a faster burning material like chaff or small sticks. The initial ignition would be quick and hot, and as the dung caught fire, it would sustain the burn long enough to heat the clay. Olive pomace, which we will discuss in detail later, was also an excellent fuel for ovens. It burned hot and clean, producing little smoke and leaving minimal residue. When available, it was the preferred fuel for both baking and heating. The heat storage capacity of the clay oven was one of the most elegant solutions to the problem of winter warmth. It required no additional fuel beyond what was already being used for daily bread production. It took advantage of the thermal mass of the clay to extend the useful life of the heat generated, and it provided a steady, gentle warmth that did not require constant attention. The oven was typically located in a central area of the home or in a sheltered corner of the courtyard where it was protected from rain, but still accessible. In courtyard houses, a single oven might serve multiple families, with each family taking turns baking their bread. The shared oven meant shared warmth as the heat radiated into the surrounding rooms and benefited all the households in the complex. The use of the oven as a heat source was not unique to the first century. Similar practices have been documented in traditional societies around the Mediterranean and the Near East well into the modern era. The principle remains the same: capture the heat from necessary tasks and extend its use as long as possible. In the coldest months, when fuel was most scarce and the nights were longest, the clay oven was as important as the hearth. Together they provided the thermal foundation that allowed families to endure the winter in their stone homes. The first century home had no chimney. This was not an oversight. Chimneys, as we know them, were a later development. They did not become common in the Mediterranean region until the medieval period. Without a chimney, the smoke from the hearth fire and the oven had nowhere to go but up. It rose with the heat, collected against the ceiling, and spread out across the upper portion of the room. The roof was not airtight. The beams and reeds that supported the mud layer left small gaps. Smoke could seep through these gaps and escape into the open air. In addition, many homes had a deliberate smoke hole, an opening left in the roof specifically to allow smoke to exit. This smoke hole was not large. A large opening would have let in rain, which would damage the interior and soak the packed earth floor. The opening was just big enough to provide ventilation, typically no more than 30 centimeters across. In some homes, it could be partially covered with a flat stone or a piece of pottery to control the amount of air flowing through. The smoke did not exit the room quickly. It lingered in the upper layer, creating a permanent haze that hung just below the ceiling. This haze was visible in the firelight, a shifting curtain of gray that marked the boundary between the clear air below and the smoke-filled space above. The family lived in the clear air zone. This was the lower portion of the room, from the floor up to about 1.5 meters in height. Above that level, the air became increasingly smoky and unpleasant to breathe. This vertical stratification influenced every aspect of daily life. People sat on low stools or directly on the floor. They reclined on mats to eat and to sleep. Standing was less common, and when it was necessary, people moved quickly through the smoke layer to complete their task and return to the clear air below. Children grew up learning to navigate this environment. They understood instinctively that the air near the floor was better than the air near the ceiling. They learned to keep their heads low when moving around the room. They learned to breathe shallowly if they had to reach up into the smoke to retrieve something from a high shelf. The smoke was not benign. It carried particulate matter, tiny fragments of ash and unburned carbon that irritated the eyes and lungs. Prolonged exposure to this smoke led to chronic respiratory problems. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was common among adults who had spent their entire lives in smoky homes. Eye infections and chronic irritation were also widespread, but the smoke served a purpose. It deterred insects and pests. The constant haze made the roof timbers less hospitable to wood-boring beetles. It kept flies and mosquitoes away. In some cases, it helped to cure and preserve meat that was hung from the rafters, as the smoke acted as a mild antibacterial agent. The smoke also indicated that the fire was functioning properly. If the smoke layer suddenly descended into the living space, it meant that the ventilation was blocked or that the fire was producing too much smoke relative to the heat. This was a signal to adjust the fuel or to check the smoke hole. The management of smoke was a constant balancing act. Too much ventilation meant that heat escaped too quickly, making the room cold. Too little ventilation meant that the smoke built up to intolerable levels, making it difficult to breathe and causing the eyes to water. The door was the primary source of fresh air. When the door was open, air flowed into the room at floor level, feeding the fire and pushing the smoke upward toward the roof opening. When the door was closed, the airflow decreased and the fire burned more slowly, producing less heat and less smoke. At night, the door was usually kept closed to retain warmth. This reduced the ventilation, but it also meant that less fuel was needed to maintain the fire. The family tolerated a slightly smokier environment in exchange for greater warmth and fuel efficiency. The design of the smoke hole was critical. If it was positioned directly above the hearth, the rising smoke and heat would exit efficiently. If it was positioned elsewhere, the smoke would spread out across the ceiling before finding the exit, increasing the density of the smoke layer in the living space. In some homes, particularly those with more than one room, the smoke hole was located in the main room where the hearth was situated. The other rooms, which did not have fires, remained smoke-free. These rooms could be used for sleeping or for storing items that needed to be kept dry and clean. The smoke layer also had a thermal effect. Warm air rises, and the smoke, being part of the warm air, collected in the upper portion of the room. This created a temperature gradient, with the hottest air near the ceiling and the coolest air near the floor. This gradient was counterintuitive. In modern homes, we try to mix the air to achieve a uniform temperature. In the first century home, the gradient was accepted and even utilized. The hot air at the ceiling helped to keep the roof dry and warm, preventing condensation from forming on the underside of the beams. The cooler air at floor level was where people lived, and it was more comfortable to breathe. The smoke hole also served as a source of natural light during the day. Even when covered, it allowed some diffuse light to enter the room. This light was often the only illumination in a windowless interior, aside from the door. At night, the smoke hole was a passage for the smoke to escape, but it was also a point of heat loss. Warm air flowed out through the opening, carrying with it the energy that the fire had generated. This loss was unavoidable, but it was minimized by keeping the opening as small as possible while still maintaining adequate ventilation. The presence of smoke in the home was a defining feature of first-century domestic life. It was a constant companion, a background element that shaped the sensory experience of the space. The smell of wood smoke or dung smoke was pervasive. It clung to clothing and hair. It permeated the walls and the textiles. For people living in this environment, the smell of smoke was not unpleasant. It was familiar. It was the smell of home, of warmth, of safety. It was associated with the hearth fire and the preparation of food. It was a marker of domestic life. The transition from the smoky interior to the fresh air outside was abrupt. Stepping out of the house into the cold, clear air of a winter morning was a sensory shift. The smoke-filled room felt enclosed and warm, even if it was uncomfortable to breathe. The outside air felt sharp and clean, even if it was cold. Living without a chimney was not ideal. It was a compromise, a solution to the problem of heating and cooking with limited technology. But it was a compromise that worked. It allowed families to maintain a fire indoors, to cook their food, to heat their homes, and to survive the winter. The chimney, when it eventually arrived, was a significant improvement. It removed the smoke from the living space and allowed for better ventilation. But for the people of the first century, the smoke was simply part of life. They adapted to it, learned to live with it, and found ways to minimize its impact while still benefiting from the warmth and light that the fire provided. Not all fuels were equal. The choice of what to burn in the hearth or the oven was determined by availability, cost, and the specific needs of the task at hand. Wood was the most desirable fuel. It ignited easily, burned hot, and produced a relatively clean flame with less smoke than other materials. The heat from burning wood was intense, making it ideal for cooking tasks that required high temperatures or for quickly warming a cold room. But wood was scarce. The forest that had once covered the hills of the Levant had been cleared over centuries of settlement and agriculture. By the first century, most of the accessible timber had already been harvested. What remained was on steep slopes or in areas that were difficult to reach. The available wood came primarily from smaller trees and shrubs. Oak, terebinth, and pine were the most common species. These trees were valued for their wood, but they were also slow-growing. A tree that was cut down might take decades to regenerate. As a result, wood was expensive. It had to be purchased from those who had access to forested land, or it had to be gathered through long trips into the hills. For a poor family, wood was a luxury that could not be afforded on a daily basis. Charcoal was even more expensive. It was produced by heating wood in a low-oxygen environment, driving off the volatile compounds and leaving behind nearly pure carbon. Charcoal burned hotter and cleaner than wood, with almost no smoke. It was the fuel of choice for metalworking, where high temperatures were essential. For domestic heating, charcoal was rarely used. The cost was prohibitive. A family that could afford charcoal would use it sparingly, perhaps only for special occasions or for tasks that absolutely required its high heat. Most families relied on secondary fuels. These were materials that had little economic value in their own right, but could be collected, dried, and burned. Animal dung was the most common secondary fuel. And in an agricultural society where every household kept at least a few animals, goats, sheep, perhaps a donkey or an ox, dung was abundant. It accumulated in the animal pens and had to be removed regularly to keep the space clean. The dung was collected and mixed with straw or chaff to give it structure. The mixture was formed into flat cakes about the size of a hand and left to dry in the sun. Once dry, the cakes were hard and could be stacked and stored like bricks. Dung cakes burned slowly. They did not produce the intense heat of wood or charcoal, but they could smolder for hours, providing a steady, low-level warmth. The heat output was roughly half that of wood, but the fuel was essentially free. It cost nothing but the labor of collecting and drying. The smoke from burning dung was significant. It was thick and acrid, with a distinctive smell. For this reason, dung was not the preferred fuel for cooking, as it could impart an unpleasant flavor to the food. But for heating, particularly for maintaining a fire overnight, dung was effective. The dung cakes were placed in the hearth in the evening, on top of a bed of coals from the day's fire. They would ignite slowly, smoldering rather than burning with a flame. This slow combustion released heat gradually, keeping the room warm through the night without the need for constant attention. Straw and chaff were also used as fuel, though they were less effective than dung. They burned quickly and produced a lot of smoke relative to the heat generated. They were primarily used as kindling to start a fire, or as an additive to other fuels to help them ignite. The chaff, left over from threshing grain, was particularly useful. It was dry and fibrous, and it caught fire easily. A handful of chaff placed beneath a stack of dung cakes or a piece of olive pomace would create the initial flame needed to get the fuel burning. Olive pomace was a fuel in a category of its own. It was the waste product of olive oil production, the crushed stones, skins, and pulp that remained after the oil had been extracted. This material was high in residual oil, which made it an excellent fuel. Pomace had a calorific value of approximately 5,360 kilocalories per kilogram, significantly higher than dung and comparable to many types of wood. It burned with a steady, hot flame and produced very little smoke. The flame was almost odorless, which made it ideal for use in the confined space of a stone home. Experimental archaeology has shown that 4 to 5 kilograms of dried pomace could burn for up to 12 hours in a small brazier or hearth. This long burn time made it exceptionally valuable for overnight heating. A family could place a quantity of pomace in the hearth before going to sleep and wake in the morning to find the fire still burning. The availability of pomace depended on access to an olive oil press. In villages where olive cultivation was a major part of the economy, pomace was plentiful. After the harvest, the presses ran continuously, and the waste accumulated in large piles. Families could collect this waste for free or for a nominal cost. In areas where olives were not cultivated, pomace had to be obtained through trade. It could be transported in sacks, dried and compact, making it relatively easy to move. But the cost of transportation added to the expense, making it less accessible to poorer families. The use of pomace as fuel was widespread. Archaeological excavations at sites like Magdala and Capernaum have uncovered large quantities of carbonized olive stones in domestic contexts. These stones are the remnants of burned pomace, indicating that this fuel was a staple of household heating. The fuel hierarchy was not rigid. Families used whatever fuel was available and affordable. Wealthier families might burn wood most of the time, supplementing with pomace when it was available. Poorer families might rely almost entirely on dung, using wood or pomace only on special occasions or when the cold was particularly severe. The choice of fuel also depended on the task. Cooking a meal required a hotter, cleaner burning fuel like wood or pomace. Maintaining warmth overnight could be done with dung. Baking bread in the oven required a fuel that could achieve high temperatures quickly, which usually meant wood or charcoal. Fuel management was a constant concern. Supplies had to be gathered or purchased in advance. Dung had to be collected and dried during the dry season, when the sun was strong and the drying process was quick. Wood had to be stockpiled before the rains began, as wet wood was difficult to burn and produced excessive smoke. The storage of fuel was also important. Dry fuel had to be kept out of the rain. A small shed or a covered area in the courtyard was used to store the stacks of dung cakes, the bundles of kindling, and the sacks of pomace. If the fuel got wet, it was useless until it dried out again. And in the middle of winter, drying could take days. The scarcity of fuel meant that nothing was wasted. The ashes from the hearth were collected and used in soap making and leather tanning. The charcoal fragments that remained after a fire were saved and used to start the next fire. Even the smallest scraps of wood or straw were gathered and added to the fuel pile. The hierarchy of fuels reflected the economic realities of the first century. Resources were limited. Every family had to make choices about how to allocate those resources. Fuel was a necessity, but it competed with other necessities like food, clothing, and shelter maintenance. The ability to stay warm through the winter was not guaranteed. It depended on having access to fuel, on having the knowledge to use it efficiently, and on having the labor to collect and prepare it. For families at the lower end of the economic scale, staying warm was a daily challenge that required ingenuity, effort, and a willingness to make do with whatever was available. Olive pomace was more than just a convenient fuel. It was a technological solution to the problem of winter heating, derived from one of the region's most important industries. The production of olive oil was central to the economy of the first century Levant. Olives were cultivated on terraced hillsides throughout Galilee and Judea. The harvest took place in late autumn, just before the winter rains began. The olives were collected and transported to the village oil press. The oil press was a communal facility. In larger villages, there might be more than one press, but most villages had a single press that served the entire community. The press was a heavy stone structure often built into a dedicated room or building. The olives were crushed in a circular basin using a large millstone. This stone, called a crushing wheel, was rolled around the basin by human or animal power. The crushing process broke open the olive flesh and released the oil, but it also pulverized the pits and created a thick paste of flesh, oil, skin, and crushed stone. This paste was then pressed to extract the oil. The pressing was done in stages, using weights or a lever mechanism to apply pressure to the paste. The oil dripped out and was collected in jars. The paste was pressed multiple times, with each pressing extracting less oil than the previous one. After the final pressing, what remained was pomace. This was the solid residue, the crushed pits, the fibrous skin, the pulp that had given up all of its oil. It was wet and compacted, but it still contained enough residual oil to make it flammable. The pomace was spread out in the sun to dry. The drying process took several days, depending on the weather. As the moisture evaporated, the pomace hardened into rough, irregular chunks. These chunks could be broken into smaller pieces and stored for later use. Dried pomace was lightweight and easy to handle. It did not rot or decay as long as it was kept dry. It could be stored for months, providing a reliable fuel source throughout the winter. The combustion characteristics of pomace were exceptional. When ignited, it burned with a steady flame. The residual oil in the material acted as an accelerant, keeping the flame alive even as the solid material was consumed. The flame was clean, producing minimal smoke and very little ash. The heat output was consistent. Unlike wood, which could burn unevenly and produce intermittent bursts of heat, pomace burned at a relatively constant rate. This made it ideal for tasks that required sustained heat, such as keeping a room warm overnight. Experimental studies have tested the burn time of pomace under controlled conditions. A 4-kilogram quantity of dried pomace placed in a small hearth or brazier burned for approximately 12 hours. This burn time varied depending on the airflow and the density of the pomace, but the 12-hour figure is a reasonable average. 12 hours was enough to cover the entire night. A family could place a quantity of pomace in the hearth at sunset and have a fire that lasted until dawn. This eliminated the need to wake during the night to tend the fire, which was a significant advantage in a cold, dark room. The use of pomace for overnight heating was not just a matter of convenience, it was also a matter of safety. A fire that burned steadily without flaring up was less likely to scatter embers onto the floor or to ignite nearby materials. The slow, controlled combustion of pomace reduced the risk of accidental fire. The availability of pomace varied by season. The olive harvest was an annual event concentrated in a few weeks in late autumn. During this period, pomace was abundant. The presses operated continuously, and the waste accumulated rapidly. Families could collect as much pomace as they needed for the winter, but pomace was only available during and immediately after the harvest. Once the pressing season ended, no new pomace was produced until the following year. Families had to collect and store enough pomace to last through the entire winter, or they had to rely on other fuels when their supply ran out. The storage of pomace was simpler than the storage of other fuels. Because it was dry and compact, it could be kept in sacks or in a covered pile. It did not attract vermin the way grain did, and it did not decompose the way wet organic matter did. As long as it was kept dry, it remained usable indefinitely. The pomace was also a commodity. In villages where olive cultivation was limited, pomace could be purchased from those who had access to the presses. The price was generally low, as the material had no other use, but even a small cost could be prohibitive for the poorest families, who had to rely on free fuels like dung. The efficiency of pomace as a fuel was recognized and valued. It allowed families to maintain warmth with less labor and less expense than other fuels required. It provided a clean-burning alternative to dung, which was appreciated in the confined space of a stone home. The pomace was placed in the hearth in the same way as other fuels. A bed of coals was prepared first, using kindling and a small amount of wood or straw. Once the coals were hot, the pomace was added. It ignited quickly, and the flame spread through the material. The pomace did not need to be stacked carefully. It could be piled loosely in the hearth, and the flame would find its way through the pile. This ease of use made it accessible even to children, who could add pomace to the fire without needing to arrange it precisely. The ash left behind after burning pomace was minimal. The crushed olive pits and skins were almost entirely consumed, leaving only a fine gray powder. This ash could be swept up and used in the same ways as wood ash, though the quantity was much smaller. The use of olive pomace as a fuel is an example of the resourcefulness that characterized first-century domestic life. Nothing was wasted. A byproduct of one industry became a critical input for another. The oil provided light and nutrition. The pomace provided warmth. Every part of the olive was utilized. This integration of agriculture and domestic life was typical of the period. The household was not isolated from the broader economy. It was embedded in a network of production and exchange, where waste from one process became a resource for another. The 12 hours of heat from a single load of pomace was more than a technical achievement. It was a measure of security. It meant that a family could sleep through the night without fear of the fire going out. It meant that the children would wake to a warm room. It meant that the stone walls, warmed by the residual heat, would hold that warmth into the early morning. In the hierarchy of fuels, pomace occupied a unique position. It was more effective than dung, cleaner than wood, and far more affordable than charcoal. It was the fuel of choice for those who had access to it, and it was the fuel that made winter nights bearable in the stone homes of Galilee and Judea. The line between the human living space and the animal space was often indistinct. In many first-century homes, there was no separation at all. The family and their animals shared the same roof, the same walls, the same air. This arrangement was not a matter of preference. It was a practical response to the threats of winter. Animals were valuable. They represented a family's wealth, their capacity to work the land, their source of milk and meat. Losing an animal to cold, predators, or theft could mean economic catastrophe. During the winter months, the most vulnerable or valuable animals were brought inside. An ox that pulled the plow was too important to risk in an exposed pen. A pregnant ewe needed protection from the cold and from jackals. A milk goat provided daily sustenance and could not be allowed to freeze. The interior of the home was modified to accommodate this dual purpose. In many houses, the floor was built on two levels. The upper level, raised perhaps half a meter above the lower level, was where the family lived, cooked, and slept. The lower level was reserved for the animals. The separation between the two levels was maintained by a low wall or a simple step in the floor. This barrier was enough to keep the animals in their designated area while allowing the family to move freely between the levels. The animals could not climb onto the raised platform, but the family could easily step down to tend them. The lower level was typically paved with rougher stones than the upper level. These stones were less carefully fitted, and the gaps between them allowed animal waste to drain away or to be more easily cleaned. The floor sloped slightly toward the door or toward a drainage channel that carried the waste outside. Stone mangers were carved into the low wall that separated the two levels, or they were built as freestanding troughs using mortared stones. These mangers held fodder for the animals, hay, straw, or grain. The animals could eat from the mangers while standing on the lower level, and the family could fill the mangers from the upper level without having to step down into the animal area. The presence of animals inside the house had a direct thermal benefit. Animals generate heat through their metabolism. A large animal like an ox or a cow produces a significant amount of heat, comparable to a small fire. Smaller animals like goats and sheep produce less heat individually, but several animals together can raise the temperature of a room by a noticeable amount. The heat generated by the animals rose from the lower level to the upper level where the family lived. In the confined space of a small stone house, this heat transfer was efficient. The warmth from the animals mixed with the warmth from the hearth fire, creating a more stable and comfortable temperature than either source could provide alone. The metabolic heat production of a resting ox is approximately 500 watts. This is roughly equivalent to 5 human bodies, or a small electric heater. In a room with limited ventilation and thick stone walls that trap heat, the contribution of a single large animal was substantial. For a family with several animals, the cumulative effect was even greater. 3 or 4 sheep plus a goat, plus a donkey could produce as much heat as the hearth fire itself. This reduced the amount of fuel needed to keep the room warm and extended the family's fuel supply through the winter. The proximity of the animals also provided economic security. A farmer could monitor his livestock throughout the night. He could hear if an animal was distressed or if it had given birth. He could respond immediately to any problem without having to leave the warmth of the house and venture into the cold darkness outside. The animals themselves benefited from being inside. They were protected from the wind and rain. They were safe from predators. The stone walls provided the same thermal mass for them as it did for the family, moderating the temperature and preventing the sharp drops that could occur in an open pen. The smell of the animals was a constant presence. The odor of wool, of hay, of manure, mixed with the smell of wood smoke and cooking food. For people living in this environment, the smell was not offensive. It was familiar. It was part of the sensory landscape of home. The arrangement of the space reflected a hierarchy of warmth. The animals occupied the coldest zone, near the door where drafts entered. The family occupied the middle zone, warmed by the hearth and by the rising heat from the animals. The sleeping platform, often positioned at the far end of the room from the door, was the warmest zone, insulated by distance from the door and elevated above the cold floor. This stratification was deliberate. The animals served as a buffer between the family and the coldest part of the house. They absorbed the brunt of the drafts and the cold air that seeped in through gaps around the door. The heat they generated compensated for this exposure, and the net effect was a more livable environment for the family. The care of the animals was integrated into the daily routine. In the morning, the mangers were filled with fresh fodder. The animals were watered either from a trough inside the house or by leading them outside to drink. The waste that had accumulated overnight was swept out through the door or scraped into a corner to be removed later. At night, the animals were settled before the family retired to sleep. The mangers were filled again to keep the animals occupied and quiet. The low wall was checked to ensure that the animals could not wander into the family's living space during the night. The integration of animals into the domestic space was not universal. Wealthier families with larger homes and separate outbuildings could afford to house their animals separately. These families might have a dedicated stable or barn, built adjacent to the main house, but separated by a wall. But for the majority of families, particularly in rural villages, the shared space was the norm. It was a practical solution that had been refined over generations. It worked because the animals were few in number, typically no more than 3 or 4 animals per household, and because the space was designed to accommodate them. The animals were not pets. They were working animals, economic assets, but they were also companions. Children grew up alongside the animals, learning to care for them, to read their behavior, to understand their needs. The rhythms of the animals' lives, their feeding times, their cycles of birth and growth, were woven into the rhythms of the household. The presence of animals in the home also clarified certain biblical narratives. The reference to a manger in the story of the Nativity becomes more comprehensible when understood in the context of a shared domestic space. The manger was not in a separate barn, but in the lower level of a crowded house where the family and their animals lived together. The shared space was crowded and noisy. The animals shifted and breathed. They chewed their fodder. They occasionally bleated or lowed, but these sounds were not disruptive. They were part of the background, a reminder of life and warmth in the cold darkness. The arrangement was not without challenges. The accumulation of animal waste required constant cleaning. The animals could damage the walls or the floor if they were not managed properly. Disease could spread from animals to humans, particularly in such close quarters. But the benefits outweighed the challenges. The warmth provided by the animals, the security of having them close, the efficiency of a shared space, all of these made the arrangement worthwhile. It was a system that worked, and it persisted because it met the needs of both the family and their livestock. The human body, at rest, produces approximately 100 watts of thermal energy. This is the heat generated by metabolism, the chemical processes that keep the body alive. The energy comes from the breakdown of food into usable compounds, and the excess heat is released through the skin, through breathing, through the natural processes of life. 100 watts is not a large amount. It is the equivalent of a standard incandescent light bulb. In an open, well-ventilated space, this heat dissipates quickly and has little effect on the surrounding temperature. But in a small, enclosed space, the cumulative heat from several bodies becomes significant. A family of 5 sleeping together in a 9-square-meter room generates 500 watts of heat. This is comparable to the heat output of a small space heater. Over the course of a night, this heat accumulates in the confined space, raising the ambient temperature by several degrees. The effect is enhanced by the thermal mass of the stone walls. The walls absorb the heat generated by the bodies and radiate it back into the room. The heat does not escape quickly because the room is sealed against drafts and the stone provides insulation. The result is a gradual warming that makes the space more comfortable than it would be without the concentration of bodies. The animals contributed to this effect as well. A single ox, as noted earlier, produces approximately 500 watts of heat. Several sheep or goats add additional warmth in a home where the animals were housed on the lower level and the family slept on the raised platform above. The heat from the animals rose and mixed with the heat from the human bodies. The combination of human and animal heat in a small, well-sealed space created a microclimate that was significantly warmer than the outside air. On a night when the exterior temperature dropped to near freezing, the interior temperature could remain several degrees above freezing, even without a fire. This passive heating was not sufficient on its own. The hearth fire was still necessary to provide the primary source of warmth, but the biological heat from bodies and animals reduced the amount of fuel needed to maintain a livable temperature. It extended the burn time of the fire. It made the difference between a cold night and a tolerable one. The effectiveness of shared body heat depended on proximity. Bodies that were separated by even a small distance did not transfer heat efficiently, but bodies that were touching, or nearly touching, shared heat directly through conduction. The skin-to-skin contact allowed warmth to flow from one body to another, equalizing the temperature and reducing the metabolic burden on each individual. This is why families slept close together. The sleeping platform was not divided into separate beds. It was a continuous surface where the entire family lay side by side, often with minimal space between them. Infants and young children were placed in the center, surrounded by the warmer bodies of the adults. The elderly, who generated less metabolic heat, were positioned close to younger family members who could share their warmth. The practice of communal sleeping was not unique to the first century. It has been documented in traditional societies around the world, particularly in cold climates where fuel is scarce. The principle is simple. Shared warmth is more efficient than individual warmth. The clothing worn during sleep also played a role. People did not remove all of their clothing at night. The chiton, the basic tunic worn during the day, was often kept on. The Himation, the heavy woolen cloak, was wrapped around the body or spread over the group as a shared blanket. These textiles trapped the heat generated by the bodies and prevented it from escaping into the surrounding air. The metabolism of sleep is lower than the metabolism of waking activity. A sleeping person generates less heat than an active person, but the difference is not dramatic. Sleep reduces metabolic heat production by about 10 to 15%. For a person generating 100 watts while awake, the heat output during sleep drops to roughly 85 or 90 watts. Over the course of a long winter night, perhaps 12 hours or more, this reduced heat output is still substantial. A family of 5 sleeping together for 12 hours generates approximately 50 kilowatt-hours of thermal energy. Not all of this energy is retained in the room, as some is lost through the walls and the roof, but a significant portion remains, contributing to the warmth of the space. The breathing of the bodies also added moisture to the air. Exhaled air is warmer and more humid than inhaled air. In a sealed room, this moisture accumulates, raising the humidity level. Higher humidity makes the air feel warmer, even if the actual temperature remains the same. This effect, known as perceived temperature or apparent temperature, improved the comfort level of the sleeping family. However, excessive humidity could also be a problem. If the room was too tightly sealed and the moisture content became too high, condensation could form on the cold stone walls. This condensation could soak into the plaster or drip onto the floor, creating dampness that reduced the insulating properties of the walls. The balance between retaining heat and preventing excessive moisture was delicate. The animals on the lower level added both heat and moisture. Their breathing, like that of humans, released warm, humid air. The evaporation of moisture from their bodies and from their waste added to the humidity of the room. This moisture rose to the upper level, where it mixed with the air around the family. The presence of moisture was generally tolerable, as the stone walls and the earthen floor could absorb some of it without immediate damage. But over time, chronic dampness could lead to the growth of mold or mildew, which was both unpleasant and potentially harmful to health. The biological heat from bodies and animals was a passive system. It required no fuel, no maintenance, no active intervention. It was simply the byproduct of life, but it was a byproduct that was essential to survival in the winter months. The clustering of bodies also had a psychological effect. The presence of others provided a sense of security and comfort. The warmth of another body was reassuring. It was a reminder that the individual was not alone in the cold and darkness. For children, the experience of sleeping surrounded by family members was formative. It created a sense of belonging and safety. The rhythms of breathing, the occasional movements, the shared warmth, all of these contributed to a collective experience of rest that was different from the solitary sleep common in modern times. The use of biological heat was not planned or designed. It was an emergent property of the living arrangements that families adopted, but it was recognized and valued. Families understood that sleeping together was warmer than sleeping apart, even if they did not have the vocabulary to explain the thermodynamics of heat transfer. The biological radiators, human and animal, were a critical component of the thermal system that allowed families to survive the winter. They supplemented the hearth fire. They reduced the demand for fuel. They created a microclimate within the stone house that was fundamentally different from the cold, dark world outside. At one end of the main room, elevated above the floor, was the sleeping platform. This raised area was one of the defining features of the first century home. It was where the family spent the hours of darkness, huddled together against the cold. The platform was typically half a meter high, built from packed earth or from rough stones mortared together. The surface was leveled and smoothed to create a continuous sleeping area. In some homes, the platform was paved with flat stones. In others, it was simply hard-packed earth covered with mats. The elevation served several purposes. Most immediately, it separated the sleeping family from the cold floor. Stone and earth are excellent conductors of heat. A body lying directly on a stone floor loses heat rapidly through conduction. The cold seeps into the body, making sleep difficult and increasing the risk of hypothermia. The raised platform broke this contact. The sleepers were elevated above the coldest layer of air which settled near the floor. The platform itself, being a mass of earth or stone, absorbed heat during the day from the hearth fire and the movement of people. At night, it released this stored heat, providing a warmer surface than the ground-level floor. The platform also created a vertical separation from the animals. In homes where livestock occupied the lower level, the raised platform ensured that the family slept above the animal area. This separation was symbolic as well as practical. The family occupied the higher, cleaner space, while the animals remained below. The edge of the platform was often defined by a low wall or a simple step. This prevented sleepers from rolling off during the night and provided a clear boundary between the sleeping area and the rest of the room. In some homes, the edge of the platform served as a bench during the day where people could sit while working or eating. The size of the platform varied with the size of the family. In a small household, the platform might be only 2 meters wide and 3 meters long, providing enough space for 3 or 4 people to sleep side by side. In larger households, the platform could extend across the entire width of the room, accommodating 6 or more sleepers. The surface of the platform was covered with sleeping mats. These mats were woven from reeds, straw, or rushes. They were flexible and could be rolled up during the day to create more usable space in the room. At night, they were unrolled and laid side by side to form a continuous sleeping surface. The mats provided a layer of insulation between the sleepers and the hard platform. They were not thick or heavily padded, but they offered some cushioning and they trapped a small amount of air, which acted as an insulator. The weaving of the mats created a texture that was more comfortable than bare stone or earth. Wealthier families might have wooden bed frames in addition to or instead of the raised platform. These frames were simple structures, often consisting of 4 posts connected by horizontal rails. Ropes were stretched across the rails in a grid pattern, creating a flexible surface that supported the weight of the sleepers. A mat or a stuffed cushion was placed on top of the ropes to provide a sleeping surface. The advantage of a bed frame was that it elevated the sleeper even further from the floor, increasing the insulation from the cold. The ropes provided a degree of flexibility that made the bed more comfortable than a hard platform. But bed frames required wood, which was expensive, and they required more space than a simple mat on the platform. For most families, the raised platform with woven mats was the standard sleeping arrangement. It was simple, inexpensive, and effective. It required only local materials and basic construction skills. It could be built into any home, regardless of size or wealth. The positioning of the platform within the room was strategic. It was typically located at the end of the room farthest from the door. This placement minimized exposure to drafts that entered through the door. The door was the primary source of cold air, as it was opened and closed throughout the day and was often not perfectly sealed. By placing the sleeping platform at the opposite end of the room, the builders created a gradient of temperature. The coldest area was near the door. The warmest area was near the back of the room, where the platform was located. The hearth was usually positioned between the door and the platform, so that the fire warmed the air before it reached the sleeping family. This spatial arrangement was not arbitrary. It was the result of experience and observation. Families knew that the back of the room stayed warmer than the front. They knew that sleeping near the door meant a colder, more restless night. The positioning of the platform was an adaptation to the thermal realities of the space. The platform also defined the social organization of the family during sleep. The head of the household typically slept in a specific position, often toward the back of the platform or in the center. The wife and children arranged themselves around him. Infants were kept close to their mother for nursing. Older children slept at the edges of the group. This arrangement was both practical and symbolic. It reflected the structure of authority within the family. It ensured that the most vulnerable members, infants and young children, were surrounded by the warmth of adult bodies. It minimized the risk of an infant rolling off the platform or becoming separated from the group during the night. The platform was not used only for sleeping. During the day, it served as a general living area. People sat on the edge of the platform to eat, to work, to talk. Children played on the platform. Women prepared food there, using the raised surface as a workspace. The platform was the cleanest and most comfortable part of the room, and it was used throughout the day for a variety of activities. At night, the transition from daytime use to sleeping use was marked by the unrolling of the mats and the gathering of the family. This transition was part of the daily rhythm, a signal that the day's work was ending and the time for rest was beginning. The mats themselves were valuable. They were handmade, woven by the women of the household during the dry season when agricultural work was less demanding. The weaving required skill and time. A single mat could take several days to complete, depending on the size and the complexity of the weave. The mats were maintained carefully. They were aired out periodically to prevent mold and to remove dust. If a mat became damaged, it was repaired or replaced. The mats were part of the household's inventory of essential goods, as important as the cooking pots or the wool cloaks. In some homes, the platform was built against a wall, which provided additional support and stability. The wall also radiated heat back onto the platform, as the stone absorbed warmth from the hearth fire during the day. Sleeping with one's back against a warm wall was more comfortable than sleeping in the center of the room, away from any heat source. The raised platform was a simple piece of architecture, but it was fundamental to the experience of winter sleep. It provided insulation from the cold floor, separation from the animals, and a defined space where the family could gather and rest. It was the foundation of the night, the place where warmth was shared and the long hours of darkness were endured. The Himation was a large rectangular cloak woven from wool. It was one of the most important items in the first-century wardrobe. During the day, it was worn draped over the shoulders, providing protection from sun, wind, and rain. At night, it became a blanket, the primary barrier between the sleeper and the cold air. The Himation was not a tailored garment. It was a simple piece of fabric, typically 2 to 3 meters long and 1 to 1.5 meters wide. The exact dimensions varied, but the proportions were consistent. A rectangle large enough to wrap around the body multiple times. The wool used to make the Himation was sheared from sheep in the spring, after the winter coat had grown thick. The fleece was washed to remove dirt and lanolin, though some lanolin was often left in the wool to provide natural water resistance. The wool was then carded to align the fibers and spun into yarn using a drop spindle. The spinning was done by the women of the household. It was a task that could be performed while sitting, while walking, while watching children. The spindle hung from the yarn, twisting as it fell, drawing the fibers into a continuous thread. The process was slow and repetitive, but it was also meditative, a rhythm that filled the hours of the day. Once the yarn was spun, it was woven on a loom. The looms used in the first century were vertical looms, where the warp threads hung from a horizontal beam and were tensioned by weights at the bottom. The weaver worked, standing or sitting, passing the weft thread back and forth through the warp using a shuttle. Weaving a Himation was a major undertaking. It could take weeks of work, depending on the skill of the weaver and the availability of time. The fabric had to be woven tightly to provide insulation and durability. Loose weaving would allow drafts to penetrate and would wear out more quickly. The finished Himation was left in its natural color, which was an off-white or cream, or it was dyed. Indigo produced a blue color, madder produced red, and various plants and minerals produced yellows, greens, and browns. The dye was expensive, so most everyday Himatia were left undyed. Dyed cloaks were a sign of modest wealth or were reserved for special occasions. The Himation was worn during the day by draping it over the left shoulder and under the right arm, leaving the right arm free for work. The fabric hung down to the knees or lower, providing coverage for most of the body. In cold weather, it could be pulled up over the head, like a hood, or wrapped more tightly around the torso. At night, the same cloak was spread over the sleeping family. If each family member had their own Himation, the cloaks could be layered to create a thicker covering. If not, a single large Himation could be shared, with the edges tucked around the bodies to trap heat. The wool provided excellent insulation. Wool fibers have a crimped structure that traps air in tiny pockets. Air is a poor conductor of heat, so these pockets of trapped air create a barrier that slows heat loss from the body. The more tightly woven the fabric, the more air it traps, and the better it insulates. Wool also has the property of retaining warmth even when damp. Unlike linen or cotton, which lose their insulating capacity when wet, wool can absorb moisture without becoming a thermal conductor. This was important in the damp climate of the winter Levant, where humidity was high and condensation was common. The Himation was heavy. A well-made woolen cloak could weigh several kilograms. This weight was an advantage at night. The heavy fabric pressed down on the body, creating a sense of security and trapping the heat generated by the sleeper. The weight also kept the cloak in place, preventing it from being kicked off during sleep. The value of the Himation cannot be overstated. It represented a significant investment of labor. The shearing, washing, carding, spinning, and weaving required hundreds of hours of work. For a poor family, this was work done by the women during moments stolen from other tasks, accumulated over months or even years. The Himation was also a marker of identity. A person without a cloak was either destitute or had been stripped of their property. The cloak was so essential to survival that it was protected by law. In Jewish law, if a cloak was taken as collateral for a loan, it had to be returned before nightfall, so that the debtor would not freeze. This legal protection is referenced in the biblical text, where the admonition to return a neighbor's cloak before sunset reflects the understanding that the cloak was literally a matter of life and death. Without it, a person could not survive a winter night. The Himation was not the only textile used at night. Wealthier families might have additional blankets made from wool or linen. These blankets could be layered over the Himation to provide extra insulation. Some families had sheepskins or goatskins with the fleece still attached, which could be used as a warm underlayer or as an additional covering. But for most families, the Himation was the primary and often the only covering. It had to serve both as daywear and as bedding. This dual use meant that it was subjected to constant wear. The fabric became thin over time, particularly at the edges and in areas of high friction. Repairs were made as needed, patching holes or reweaving torn sections. The care of the Himation was an ongoing task. It had to be kept clean, though washing was infrequent due to the labor involved. A large woolen cloak could not be washed easily in a small household. Instead, it was aired out, brushed to remove dirt and debris, and spot cleaned when necessary. The lanolin in the wool provided some natural resistance to stains and odors, but the cloak still absorbed the smells of daily life: smoke from the hearth, sweat from the body, the scent of animals. These smells became part of the fabric, a sensory marker of the household. The Himation was also a canvas for personal expression. While most cloaks were plain, some were decorated with simple stripes or borders, woven in a contrasting color. These decorations were not elaborate, but they distinguished one cloak from another and allowed the wearer to express a degree of individual style within the constraints of the culture. At night, when the Himation was spread over the sleeping family, it became more than just a piece of fabric. It was a shared resource, a communal shelter. The edges of the cloak were tucked around the bodies, creating a sealed environment where heat could accumulate. The weight of the fabric pressed down, holding the warmth close to the skin. The experience of sleeping under a woolen Himation was different from sleeping under modern blankets. The fabric was rougher, less refined. It had texture and weight. It smelled of wool and of the household. But it was effective. It kept the body warm through the cold hours of the night, and it was durable enough to last for years with proper care. The Himation was a technology, in the truest sense of the word. It was a tool for survival, crafted from available materials using traditional techniques. It was the product of knowledge passed down through generations, refined and adapted to the specific needs of the climate and the culture. Without the Himation, winter nights would have been far more difficult, perhaps impossible for many families. It was not a luxury, it was a necessity, as essential as the stone, walls, and the hearth fire. It was the final layer of protection, the barrier that kept the body warm when all other sources of heat had faded. Sleep in the first century was not a private act. It was communal. The family slept together, bodies touching or nearly touching, sharing warmth in the darkness. This arrangement was not a choice made for comfort or intimacy, though those may have been secondary benefits. It was a necessity dictated by the cold and by the scarcity of resources. A single person sleeping alone in a cold room would lose heat rapidly to the surrounding air. A group of people sleeping together could pool their heat, creating a microenvironment that was significantly warmer than the room itself. The mechanics of heat sharing are straightforward. Each human body generates heat through metabolism. This heat radiates outward from the skin into the surrounding air. In an open, well-ventilated space, the heat disperses quickly and has little effect on the ambient temperature. But when two bodies are in close proximity, the heat radiated by one body is absorbed by the other. The air between the bodies is warmed by both sources, creating a pocket of warm air that is trapped between them. This pocket acts as an insulator, reducing the rate of heat loss from each body. The effect is amplified when more than two bodies are involved. A group of 5 or 6 people sleeping side by side creates multiple overlapping pockets of warm air. The bodies in the center of the group are warmed from both sides, while the bodies on the edges are warmed from one side and insulated by the mass of the group. The positioning of individuals within the group was important. Infants and young children, who have a higher surface area to volume ratio and lose heat more quickly than adults, were placed in the center. Their small bodies were surrounded by the larger, warmer bodies of adults, which provided maximum insulation. The elderly, whose metabolic heat production is lower, were also positioned close to younger family members. An elderly person sleeping alone would struggle to maintain body temperature through the night. But sleeping between two adults, sharing their warmth, the elderly person could remain comfortable. The head of the household and the primary adult members occupied the positions that provided the best access to the warmth of the group, while also maintaining a degree of authority and control. These positions were not explicitly assigned, but they emerged from the social structure of the family and the practical needs of sleep. The sleeping platform was just large enough to accommodate the entire family. There was no wasted space. Bodies were pressed close together with minimal gaps between them. Arms and legs overlapped. Children curled against their parents. The entire group formed a single, coherent mass. This physical closeness was accepted as normal. There was no expectation of personal space during sleep. The concept of privacy as it exists in modern cultures did not apply. The body was not a private domain. It was part of the collective, and its warmth was a shared resource. The textiles that covered the group enhanced the effect of shared body heat. The Himation, spread over the entire family, trapped the warm air rising from the bodies and prevented it from escaping into the cold room. The weight of the fabric pressed down on the group, sealing the edges and creating a tent-like structure that held the warmth inside. Underneath the group, the sleeping mats provided a layer of insulation from the raised platform. The platform itself, warmed by the hearth fire during the day, contributed additional heat from below. The combination of insulation from below, heat generation from within, and trapping from above created a thermal microenvironment that was fundamentally different from the surrounding room. The temperature difference between the inside of the sleeping group and the ambient air in the room could be several degrees Celsius. This difference was enough to make sleep possible on a night when the room temperature dropped near freezing. The breathing of the group also contributed to the warmth. Exhaled air is warm and contains moisture. In the confined space beneath the Himation, this warm, moist air accumulated, raising the humidity and the perceived temperature. The moisture condensed on the inner surface of the wool, releasing latent heat that further warmed the microenvironment. However, excessive moisture could also be a problem. If the space became too humid, condensation could soak the Himation, reducing its insulating capacity. The balance between retaining warmth and preventing excessive dampness was maintained through small adjustments, partially lifting the edge of the cloak to allow some ventilation, or repositioning to reduce the density of bodies in one area. The sounds of the sleeping group were constant: breathing, shifting, occasional movements. These sounds were not disruptive. They were part of the environment, a background rhythm that was familiar and reassuring. The presence of others, even in sleep, was a source of comfort and security. For children, the experience of sleeping in close contact with family members shaped their understanding of intimacy and belonging. The warmth of a parent's body, the rhythm of their breathing, the sense of being surrounded and protected, all of these contributed to a feeling of safety that was foundational to their development. For adults, the shared sleep was a continuation of the shared labor of the day. The family worked together, ate together, and slept together. There was no separation between the different aspects of life. Everything was communal. Everything was shared. The practice of communal sleeping was not unique to this time or place. It has been documented in many traditional societies, particularly in cold climates. The Inuit of the Arctic, the nomadic peoples of Central Asia, the highland communities of the Andes, all developed similar strategies for shared warmth during sleep. The first-century Levant was not as cold as these other regions, but the principle was the same. When fuel is scarce and the nights are long, the most efficient source of warmth is the human body itself. Shared sleep is a way of harnessing this warmth, of making it available to the entire group rather than allowing it to dissipate into the air. The arrangement also had practical benefits beyond warmth. A group sleeping together was more secure than individuals sleeping alone. If a predator or an intruder approached, the movement or sound would wake someone who could alert the others. The collective vigilance of the group provided protection. The transition to sleep was gradual. As the evening progressed and the hearth fire burned down, the family gathered on the sleeping platform. The mats were arranged, the Himation was spread, and the group settled into position. There was no formal bedtime, no ritual marking the transition. Sleep came when the work of the day was done, and the darkness was complete. Waking was also gradual, as the first light of dawn seeped into the room, or as the fire needed tending. One person would rise. The movement would disturb the others, who would begin to wake. The group would disentangle, the Himation would be folded, and the day would begin. The shared sleep was not always peaceful. Infants cried, children had nightmares, adults snored or shifted restlessly. But these disruptions were tolerated because they were unavoidable. There was no alternative. The family slept together because that was the only way to survive the night. The memory of shared sleep was carried forward into the culture. The concept of hospitality, of welcoming strangers into the home and offering them a place to sleep, was rooted in the understanding that sleep was a communal act. To invite someone to sleep under your roof was to invite them into the warmth of your family, to share your resources, to offer them protection from the cold and the darkness. The shared body heat was not a perfect solution. It did not make the night warm or comfortable by modern standards, but it made the night survivable. It allowed families to endure the winter without burning through unsustainable amounts of fuel. It was a strategy born of necessity, refined through experience, and embedded in the fabric of daily life. As the sun descended and the interior of the stone house grew dim, the transition to night began with light, not the light of the hearth fire, which had been burning throughout the day, but the deliberate, careful light of the oil lamp. The lamp was a small object, easily held in one hand. The most common type in the first century was the Herodian lamp, named for the period of its manufacture. It was wheel-made, formed from clay on a potter's wheel, with a separate nozzle attached by hand. The body of the lamp was round or slightly oval, with a small filling hole at the top and a pinch spout at one end where the wick protruded. The lamp held only a small amount of oil, typically enough to burn for 3 to 4 hours. This limited capacity meant that the lamp was not a source of continuous illumination throughout the night. It was used during the evening hours while the family was still active, and then allowed to burn out as sleep approached. The fuel was olive oil. This was the same oil used for cooking and for anointing the body. It was a valuable commodity, produced from the olive harvest and stored in large jars throughout the year. Using oil for light was an expense, but it was a necessary one. Without light, the transition from day to night would have been abrupt and disorienting. The oil was poured into the lamp through the filling hole. Care was taken not to overfill, as spilled oil was wasted. The wick, made from flax, hemp, or cotton, was inserted through the nozzle so that one end sat in the oil and the Other protruded slightly from the spout. The wick drew the oil upward through capillary action. The oil-soaked portion of the wick was ignited using an ember from the hearth fire. A small stick or piece of straw was touched to the coals, caught fire, and was used to light the wick. The flame took hold, burning the oil as it was drawn up through the wick. The light produced by the lamp was modest. Experimental measurements have shown that a typical Herodian lamp-burning olive oil produces approximately 0.35 lux of illumination at a distance of 1 centimeter from the flame. This is roughly equivalent to 1 candle power, a unit that describes the light output of a single candle. In a modern context, this level of illumination seems inadequate. A standard household light bulb produces hundreds or thousands of lux. But in the absolute darkness of a windowless stone room, the light from a single oil lamp was remarkably effective. The human eye adapts to low light levels, and once adapted, a single candle provides enough light for basic tasks. The lamp was placed on a lampstand, a simple pedestal made of wood or clay, or it was set in a niche carved into the stone wall. The elevation ensured that the light spread across the room rather than being blocked by objects on the floor. The niche protected the lamp from being knocked over and provided a fixed location that became familiar to the household. The flame was not steady. It flickered and danced, responding to currents of air in the room. The movement of the flame created moving shadows that played across the walls. These shadows were not an annoyance. They were part of the atmosphere of the evening, a visual rhythm that accompanied the sounds and smells of the household. The quality of the light depended on the wick material. Cotton wicks burned longer and more steadily than hemp or flax, but cotton was more expensive and not always available. Hemp wicks burned quickly, lasting only 20 to 30 minutes per charge of oil. Flax wicks fell somewhere in between, burning for 25 to 40 minutes. The choice of wick was a matter of economy and availability. Families used what they had. If cotton was available, it was preferred. If not, flax or hemp sufficed. The important thing was to have a wick that would draw the oil and hold a flame. The lamp required tending. As the oil was consumed, the wick burned down and had to be adjusted. If the wick became too short, the flame would sputter and die. If it became too long, the flame would smoke excessively. The person responsible for tending the lamp, often one of the women of the household, monitored the flame and trimmed the wick as needed. The ritual of lighting the lamp marked the beginning of the evening. It was a deliberate act, a transition from the work of the day to the quieter activities of the night. The moment when the lamp was lit was often accompanied by a sense of settling, of gathering together, of preparing for rest. The light of the lamp allowed for tasks that required some degree of visibility. Women could continue spinning or mending textiles. Men could sharpen tools or repair equipment. Children could be tended to. Injuries could be examined. Food could be prepared for the morning. The lamp provided the minimal illumination needed for these activities, but the lamp was not sufficient for reading or for detailed work. The light was too dim and too uneven. For such tasks, natural daylight was required. The evening hours, lit only by the lamp and the hearth fire, were a time for simple, repetitive activities that did not demand precise vision. The scent of burning olive oil was distinct. It was slightly fruity, with a clean aroma that was different from the heavier smell of wood smoke. The oil burned without producing the thick, acrid smoke of dung or straw. This clean combustion made the lamp suitable for use in the confined space of the house without adding significantly to the air quality problems caused by the hearth fire. The lamp was also a symbol. In Jewish tradition, the lamp represented the presence of life and the continuation of the household. A house without a lit lamp was a house in mourning or abandonment. The light of the lamp was a statement that the family was present, that life continued, that the household endured. The placement of the lamp was sometimes mentioned in teaching and parable. The image of a lamp set on a stand, giving light to all in the house, appears in biblical texts as a metaphor for visibility and purpose. This metaphor resonated because it reflected a daily reality that everyone understood. As the evening progressed, the oil in the lamp was consumed. The flame gradually diminished as the oil level dropped. Eventually, the wick would reach the bottom of the reservoir, and the flame would flicker and die. This natural extinguishing of the lamp was a signal that the time for sleep had come. In some households, the lamp was deliberately extinguished before sleep to conserve oil. The flame was blown out or snuffed with a tool, and the lamp was set aside to be refilled and relit the next evening. In other households, the lamp was allowed to burn out naturally, providing light as long as the oil lasted. The transition from light to darkness was gradual. As the lamp flame weakened, the room grew dimmer. The shadows deepened. The faces of family members, visible in the lamplight moments before, faded into obscurity. The room became a space of sound and warmth rather than sight. The darkness was absolute. In a windowless room with no lamp and only the faint glow of the banked hearth fire, there was no light at all. The darkness was thick and enveloping. It was a presence, a weight that filled the space and pressed against the eyes. This darkness was not feared. It was expected. It was the natural state of the night, and the family had adapted to it. Movement in the dark was done by memory and by touch. The layout of the room was familiar. The position of the sleeping platform, the location of the hearth, the placement of storage jars, all of these were known and could be navigated without sight. The lamp, while it burned, held this darkness at bay. It created a circle of visibility, a small island of light in the surrounding black. When the lamp went out, the darkness returned, but it returned gently, without suddenness or alarm. The ritual of the lamp was a daily practice, repeated every evening throughout the winter. It was a marker of time, a way of structuring the transition from day to night. It was also a measure of household economy. The amount of oil consumed by the lamp over the course of a winter was significant, and families had to plan accordingly, ensuring that they had enough oil to last through the dark months. The lamp was utilitarian, but it was also beautiful in its simplicity. The clay was often left unglazed, showing the natural color of the fired earth. Some lamps were decorated, with simple stamped patterns or molded designs around the filling hole. These decorations did not enhance the function of the lamp, but they added a touch of craftsmanship to an everyday object. The lamp was one of the most common artifacts found in archaeological excavations of first-century domestic sites. Their abundance speaks to their ubiquity. Every household had at least one lamp, and many had several. They were inexpensive to produce and essential to daily life. The light of the lamp was a gift, a small miracle of human ingenuity. It extended the useful hours of the day. It provided comfort and security in the darkness. It allowed the family to gather and to share the final moments of the day before surrendering to sleep. When the lamp went out, the night truly began. For Jewish families in the first century, the observance of the Sabbath introduced a unique challenge to the management of winter warmth. The Sabbath, or Shabbat, was a day of rest that began at sunset on Friday and ended at sunset on Saturday. During these 25 hours, work of all kinds was prohibited. This prohibition included the lighting of fire. Once the Sabbath began, no new fire could be kindled. No flame could be transferred from one source to another. No fuel could be added to an existing fire. The fire that burned on Friday afternoon would have to sustain the household through the entire Sabbath, or the household would have to endure the day and night without heat. In warmer seasons, this was manageable. The absence of fire for one day was uncomfortable, but not dangerous. But in winter, particularly during the coldest months, the prohibition posed a serious threat to the well-being of the family. The solution was preparation. On Friday afternoon, before the sun set and the Sabbath began, the family engaged in intensive heating of the house. The hearth fire was stoked to its maximum capacity. The taban or tanner oven was fired and brought to its highest temperature. Every surface capable of storing heat was warmed. The goal was to charge the thermal mass of the house, the stone walls, the clay oven, the packed earth floor, with as much heat as possible. This stored heat would then be released slowly over the course of the Sabbath, providing warmth even though no new fuel could be added. The tabun oven was particularly important in this strategy. Its thick clay walls could store enormous amounts of heat. A fully heated tabun could remain warm to the touch for 12 hours or more. If the oven was fired to maximum temperature late on Friday afternoon, it would continue radiating warmth well into Saturday. Some families baked their bread for the Sabbath on Friday afternoon, using the oven at its peak temperature. Once the baking was complete, The residual heat in the oven continued to warm the house. The oven door might be left slightly open to allow the heat to flow more freely into the living space. The hearth fire was also managed carefully. Wood, if available, was used to build a large fire that would burn hot and long. If pomace was available, it was added to the fire in generous quantities, taking advantage of its long burn time. The goal was to create a fire that would burn through Friday night and into Saturday without needing fresh fuel. In some cases, the fire was banked heavily with ash before the Sabbath began. This slowed the combustion and preserved the coals, allowing the fire to smolder through the entire Sabbath. The coals would not produce much heat, but they would produce some, and they would remain alive so that they could be revived after the Sabbath ended. The walls of the house, warmed by the fire throughout Friday, acted as a thermal battery. The 60-centimeter thickness of stone absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. The rate of heat release depended on the temperature differential between the stone and the surrounding air. The greater the initial temperature, the longer the heat would last. The family also relied on passive heat sources. The animals, brought inside as usual, continued to generate metabolic heat. The bodies of the family members huddled together on the sleeping platform provided warmth through the night. The woolen himation, layered over the group, trapped this heat and prevented it from escaping. Despite these preparations, the Sabbath was often colder than other days. As the hours passed and the stored heat dissipated, the temperature in the house gradually dropped. By Saturday afternoon, particularly if the weather outside was especially cold, the interior could become uncomfortably chilly. Rabbinic law, developed in the centuries following the first century, addressed this challenge. The Mishnah and Talmud contain extensive discussions about what was permissible on the Sabbath in relation to warmth. The general principle was that preservation of life overrode the Sabbath prohibitions. If the cold reached a level where it posed a danger to health, particularly for the young or the elderly, exceptions could be made. One such exception allowed for a non-Jew to tend the fire on behalf of a Jewish household. The non-Jew was not bound by the Sabbath laws and could add fuel or rekindle the fire if necessary. This arrangement required the presence of non-Jewish neighbors or servants, which was more common in urban areas than in rural villages. Another approach was to increase the insulation during the Sabbath. Extra textiles were layered over the sleeping group. Sheepskins or additional himation were brought out from storage. The family stayed on the sleeping platform as much as possible, minimizing their exposure to the colder areas of the room. The Sabbath also required advanced preparation of food. Since cooking over an open flame was prohibited, meals had to be prepared before sunset on Friday. These meals were often slow-cooked stews that were placed in the taboon oven or near the hearth fire before the Sabbath began. The residual heat cooked the food slowly so that it was ready to eat on Saturday. This practice gave rise to specific Sabbath dishes, such as cholent in later Jewish tradition, which were designed to be cooked slowly over many hours. The food was placed in a sealed pot and left in the warm oven overnight. By Saturday midday, the stew had cooked to tenderness and was ready to be eaten. The eating of warm food on a cold Sabbath provided both nourishment and a psychological boost. The warmth of the food transferred to the body, raising the core temperature and providing comfort. It was a small but significant contribution to the family's ability to endure the day. The prohibition against kindling fire also meant that the oil lamp could not be lit during the Sabbath. If a lamp was lit before sunset on Friday, it could be allowed to burn until the oil was consumed. But once it went out, it could not be relit until after the Sabbath ended. This meant that the Sabbath night was often spent in complete darkness, except for the faint glow of the banked hearth fire. The darkness was deeper and more absolute than on other nights, and the family relied even more on memory and touch to navigate the space. The Sabbath was a test of the household's thermal management skills. It required planning, resource allocation, and an understanding of how heat moved through the house. Families that prepared well could remain relatively comfortable. Families that did not prepare or that lacked the resources to heat the house adequately on Friday faced a difficult and uncomfortable day. The observance of the Sabbath also reinforced the communal nature of survival. Neighbors checked on each other, particularly on the elderly or infirm. If a household was struggling with the cold, assistance could be offered within the bounds of what was permissible. This mutual support was part of the social fabric of the village. The end of the Sabbath, marked by the appearance of 3 stars in the Saturday evening sky, was a moment of relief. The fire could be rekindled, the lamp could be lit, the household could return to normal activity. The ritual that marked the end of the Sabbath, called Havdalah, often included the lighting of a braided candle, symbolizing the return of fire and the transition back to the ordinary days of the week. The Sabbath challenge was unique to Jewish households, but it illustrates a broader principle that applied to all families in the first century. Warmth was not a given. It had to be earned through labor and planning. The thermal resources of the household had to be managed carefully, with an awareness of both the capacities and the limitations of the available materials and fuels. The Sabbath was a day of rest, but it was also a day that tested the household's resilience and ingenuity. It was a reminder that survival in the winter required more than just physical resources. It required knowledge, community, and a willingness to adapt to the constraints imposed by both nature and tradition.